Whiria te taura, te kaia te korowai tuakiri. Kia rongo i te mana, kia rongo i te Māori, kia mā koha, kia mahana, kia wātea, tūraha. Ko te mihi tuatahi ki te atua nāna nei ngā mea katoa. Ko te mihi tuarua ki te hunga mate, haere atu rā. Ko te mihi tuaruturu ki te hunga, ora kua hui mai nei tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko tongariro me ruapehu ngā maunga, ko Wanganui me hautapu ngā awa. Ko te arawa me Aotea ngā waka, ko Wanganui ki Taupo Moana me Ōpaia ngā marae. Ko Tuwharetoa me te Atihaunui a Paparangi ngā iwi, ko Ngāti te Maunga me ngā Pairangi ngā hapu. He kai hāpai hāpore āhau ki te tare ture hāpore o Papakura, ko Katene Peretini āhau. Good morning, everybody. I've just done a brief karakia and mihi, and then I introduced myself through pepeha and where I work and what I do. I'm currently working for the Community Law Office and based out of Papakura, but we are also based out of Ōtara, so I go in between those two offices. But for this purpose, I am actually speaking from the Ōtara branch, and what I will be talking to you today about is to do with tenancies. The topics that we will be covering is types of tenancy agreements, and the new piece of law that's come through, rules about pets. We have only a very short time in which I can cover some of them, so I will only touch on a few of the more prominent pieces in each one of those sections. I hope in the future that we may be able to do a Q&A, but for this purpose we'll just be covering in our types of tenancies, periodic or fixed term tenancies, and boarding houses, tenancy agreements, the required statements, making changes to a tenancy agreement, and the third part is the rules about pets. And we'll just be covering over what the responsibilities will be from the landlords to the tenants' responsibilities. So let's get into it. So in a periodic tenancy, it starts with the landlord and the tenant agreeing to a tenancy agreement. The periodic tenancy agreement has no end date. It continues until either the tenant or the landlord gives the correct written notice to end the periodic tenancy. If a fixed term tenancy is coming to an end and neither party gives the correct notice, the fixed term tenancy automatically becomes a period tenancy. Does that make sense? Yes? Cool. Yep. So I'll then move into, and I'll come back to giving notice to tenancy, to end a tenancy, but I'll move into what a fixed term tenancy is. A fixed term tenancy agreement lasts for a set amount of time that is more than 90 days, for example. For example, a year. There is no maximum length for a fixed term tenancy. You must include the length on the tenancy agreement and the date the fixed term ends. You can only give notice to end a fixed term tenancy early if the landlord and the tenant both agree. So with anything that belongs in a contract, it needs to be with the agreement of both parties. Once the fixed term ends, the fixed term tenancy automatically becomes a periodic tenancy, unless during the period that starts on the 90th day or before expiry and ends on the 21st day before expiry, which is the effective period. Either party gives the other written notice, and it must be written, and nowadays texts and messaging is considered to be the written notice, and that they intend or do not intend for the tenancy to continue. The tenant exercises a right of renewal if it's applicable, and both tenant and landlord agree on the alternative arrangement. You should make sure a fixed term tenancy is right for you. It's not right for everyone. Before you sign the agreement, there are always other types of tenancies, and we may be able to cover those at a later stage. So now that we've touched on types of tenancies, we'll move over to tenancy agreements. So in regards to a tenancy agreement, you have a very, like I mentioned earlier, tenancy services got quite a good a page on what is expected of a tenant. What we have had in the past is, and this is something that we will talk about, is when you're making changes to a tenancy agreement. As we spoke about in the earlier part of this discussion, is to continue a fixed term tenancy. A fixed term tenancy will automatically continue as a periodic tenancy at the end of the term, unless the landlord or the tenant gives the correct notice to end the tenancy, or the landlord and tenant agrees to renew it. And you can agree to renew it to whatever period you want it to, as long as it's with agreement to the other party. So as long as there's that open line of communication working between the landlord and the tenant to ensure that can be working for you. Rent increases. Now we've had quite a lot of rent increases, inquiries about that. So the basic part is the rent increase notice does not require written variation or a tenant signature to the tenancy agreement, as the notice can be issued without the tenant's prior agreement, as long as the notice complies with all legal requirements. In some situations, the tenant and landlord may agree to increase the rent if the landlord has either made substantial improvements to the premises, increased or improved the facilities or services, or agreed to vary the terms of the tenancy and it benefits the tenant. In these situations, the increases in rent would be a variation of the tenancy agreement. There has been, for rent increases, it's not normal to increase the rent within the first 12 months of the tenancy. For both fixed term and periodic tenancies, landlords can only increase the rent 12 months after tenancy start date. If the increase is not within the 12 months from the last rent increase, then there's other expectations or requirements of the landlord for the tenant. And for fixed term tenancies, landlords can increase rent if the tenancy agreement allows it. So there would be a clause in your tenancy agreement to show that there would be an expectation that there's an increase of rent. Landlords must give the correct notice and meet certain conditions. And again, this is covered in great detail on the Tenancy Services website. What I will cover with the landlords, landlords must give their tenant at least 60 days of written notice of a rent increase. Boarding house landlords must give their tenant at least 28 days notice. The 60 days notice, a written notice, can be given in advance of the 12-month period expiry. The rent increase can only take effect 12 months after the date of the last rent increase took effect and 12 months after the date the tenancy started. Now, again, if you want to get more information about that, please look on the Tenancy Services website. The notice must be served in writing, say how much the rent is increasing to, and the day the increased rent is due. The landlord should keep a copy of the notice. If the landlord does not give the correct notice, they can serve it again correctly, so there's a chance to remedy the mistake. Ask the tenant to let them extend the notice time so it is correct, or apply to the tenancy tribunal to extend the notice. The tenant will not allow the landlord to extend it. There is quite a lot involved in the notification side of it, and we won't have time to cover that today. Right, rules about pets. Now, this is the third part to the series that we're talking about. Rules about pets. Now, this only just came in recently. It says, right, if a tenant wants to keep an animal as a pet at their property, there are rules they must meet to be able to keep the pet. If the tenant wants to start keeping a pet on or after the 1st of December 2025, they must request a pet consent. If the landlord approves, they can set certain conditions the tenant has to meet, for example, to pay a pet bond. If the landlord declines, they must have a valid reason. So the landlord's got to give reasons for it. If a tenant started keeping a pet before the 1st of December 2025, there are different rules that apply to them. And I think we should cover that in more depth here because it's such a new piece of legislation that's come through. Pet rules change on the 1st of December 2025. If a tenant started keeping a pet before this date that was approved by the landlord, some of the new rules do not apply. Alright, so rules about pets. If a tenant wants to keep an animal as a pet at their property, there are rules they must meet to be able to keep the pet. If a tenant wants to start keeping a pet on or after the 1st of December, they must request a pet consent. If the landlord approves, they can set certain conditions the tenant has to meet, for example, to pay a pet bond. If the landlord declines, they must have a valid reason. If a tenant started keeping a pet before the 1st of December, there are different rules that apply to them. What is a pet? If a tenant wants to keep an animal as a pet at their property, the tenant and landlord should agree it is a pet. Find out what is considered a pet and the exemptions for disability assist dogs. Requesting pet consents. If a tenant wants to keep an animal as a pet at their property, there are rules they must meet to be able to keep the pet. I have mentioned the criteria in which if you keep a pet on or after the 1st of December, you must request a pet consent. The Residential Tenancies Act 1986 does not define what a pet is. This means it is up to the landlord and tenant to agree on what is considered a pet. Every rental situation will be different. When deciding whether an animal is a pet, consider whether it is kept mainly for companionship or leisure, domesticated and lives in or around the property, usually seen at living at a residential property. Now, they do go on and do refer to disability assist dogs. Disability assist dogs are exempt from pet rules in the Residential Tenancies Act 1986. These are dogs that are certified by the organisations listed in Schedule 5 of the Dog Control Act 1996. So they come under a different piece of legislation and they do not require permission to be living with the owner. So, okay, on rules of pets. When can landlords refuse pets? If a landlord declines a pet consent request, they must have a valid reason. If they do not have one, they could receive a financial penalty. A valid reason is called reasonable grounds. There are legal restrictions. The tenant has not met the animal bylaws. The pet is not suitable for the property. The tenant does not meet pet consent conditions. The Residential Tenancies Act 1986 does not explain what is meant by a reasonable ground. This means the landlord needs to apply logic and fairness when declining a pet consent request. The landlord could have one or more reasonable grounds. Now, there are definitions of the property is not suitable for the pet. The property is too small. There is little to no fencing. The property has unique features that would be difficult to repair if damaged by a pet, and the property has unique features that make keeping a pet risky or practical. Now, these are only some examples of how they can refuse it. There could be more. Now, there are legal restrictions. Sometimes pets are not legally allowed at the pet. This could be due to local authority rules, bylaws or regulations, for example, local regional councils, or body corporate rules or cross-lease agreements. Again, that needs to be discussed in full with the landlord. Now, the tenant has not met the animal bylaws. Now, that could be due to pet registrations, not microchipping, not desexing, and containment requirements, which is whether the property is suitable for an animal to be in it. Each local council can have different rules, so you must check those. Now, the pet is not suitable for the property. There's too many pets on the property already. The size, type or breed of the pet's potential to cause damage or disrupt neighbours, and the pet is classified as dangerous or menacing under the Dog Control Act 1996. Just to finish that off, it's like, if a tenant thinks a reason is not valid, it is recommended the tenant talks to the landlord to try and reach an agreement. If that cannot be reached, the tenant can apply for mediation or to the Tenancy Tribunal. Before applying, it is suggested you gather evidence to prove your case, for example, council records or references from previous landlords. If the landlord declines without reasonable grounds, they could receive a penalty of up to $1,500. Now, I think I've covered as much as I can for the time that we've got on this podcast. We will come back and cover some more parts of tenancy matters in regards to rights and responsibility of landlords and tenants. Kia ora.